My entitled neighbor was stealing from me, so I let consequences do the talking. When I first got the call that the house was mine, I felt this rush of pride, like I'd just pulled off the deal of the century. A house, smack in the middle of the capital city, with a yard big enough for my dogs for half the market price? It almost felt criminal how cheap it was. The previous owners were family friends. They'd left the country 3 years ago and hadn't looked back. The place had been sitting empty ever since, abandoned mid-renovation, unfinished walls, a half-tiling job in the kitchen, and the front door sealed with nothing more than a rusty padlock. No deadbolt, no alarm, just a loose piece of chain and a 30-cent lock standing between the house and the world. Still, I saw potential. I didn't care that the gate was missing or the fact that weeds had claimed most of the front yard. It was mine, a fresh start. But then day 1 happened. I'd just pulled into the driveway ready to officially move in when something felt off. Not the usual new house jitters either. It was more like I had stepped into someone else's routine, like I was intruding in a space that hadn't realized it was no longer empty. The garage door creaked open, and there it was. A bike. Not mine. Not something left behind in the sale. Just a random, beat-up old motorcycle sitting casually in my garage like it paid rent. My first thought wasn't even anger. It was confusion. Then annoyance. Then something darker. Discomfort. Someone had clearly been using the property like a public space. I didn't ask questions. I didn't leave a note. I dragged that thing to the curb and parked it on the road. Right then and there, I made my first call. A contractor to install a proper gate. I wasn't about to live in an open invitation. Later that afternoon, I heard someone banging at the gate. Not knocking, banging. I peeked out my bedroom window just in time to see a man, red-faced and pacing, standing outside my brand-new gate. He never called out, never introduced himself, just hovered like he expected the universe to open up for him. After 15 minutes of him growing increasingly agitated and muttering to himself, he finally gave up and rolled his bike away. I never said a word. I just watched. And that's when the unease really started to settle in. It wasn't just about the bike. It was about the tone, the entitlement. The idea that someone could wander in, treat my home like theirs, and get angry when I reclaimed it. At first, I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he didn't know the house had been sold. Maybe he'd been using the garage out of convenience while it was abandoned. But that didn't explain the attitude, or why my stomach had twisted into knots. For a few days after, it was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. No bikes, no strangers. But the space still felt watched. The gate helped. I even slapped a big no parking sign right on it because apparently vacant had become code for communal space. Things seemed to stabilize. No more random vehicles. No one banging on the gate. I thought maybe the worst was behind me. Not long after the bike incident, I started piecing together more of the neighborhood dynamic. Or maybe it's better to say I started noticing who was watching me and who wasn't hiding it. Next door to me was a squat, wide 3-story building with cracking concrete and sun-faded curtains on every floor. The bottom unit had an old metal chair parked outside like a permanent fixture. And in that chair sat a man who looked like he'd been born there. Late 60s, maybe older, with that particular kind of scowl that deepens the longer you stay within his line of sight. He didn't wave, didn't nod, just stared. Eventually, I learned he was the landlord of the place, lived on the ground floor, and rented out the top 2 levels to tenants. It was the kind of arrangement that worked for someone who didn't want to give up control, but also couldn't fully afford his own home anymore. And apparently he wasn't thrilled that the house next to his had been sold. Friends of mine, the previous owners, had already warned me. Said the man had raised a fuss before the sale even went through. Something about neighborhood integrity and who let outsiders in. Not subtle. But they also said he never did anything beyond complain. He'd just mutter under his breath and slam his door for effect. I wasn't too worried. I'm 6 feet tall, I've got 3 dogs, and I don't scare easily. If he thought I'd be easy to intimidate, he was going to be disappointed. That said, he wasn't the type to knock on my door or make any direct move. He preferred passive resistance, silence, cold stares, and the kind of energy that made you feel like you were always trespassing. I started calling him the sentry in my head. He was always there, always watching. At first, I tried to brush it off. People don't like change, especially people who've made their routines out of other people's neglect. Maybe my house being abandoned had served him in more ways than one. Maybe he liked that nobody questioned anything. But then the water issues started. It was barely a week into living there when I first noticed it. I was in the middle of a shower, shampoo halfway down my back, when the water pressure dipped hard. Not a trickle, but noticeably weaker. Enough to make me frown, rinse faster, and chalk it up to old plumbing. I wasn't new to fixer-uppers. I knew the pipes needed work. But that nagging feeling I'd had since day one started whispering again. And then I heard it. A distant humming, like machinery, faint but consistent, coming from next door. His water pump. I hadn't paid attention to it before, but once you hear that rhythmic drone, you can't unhear it. It kicked on right around the time my pressure dropped. Now, to understand what that meant, you need to know how water systems work where I live. Our public water supply doesn't have the pressure to push water all the way to the roof tanks on multi-story homes. Everyone who lives in a place taller than one floor uses a pump. It pulls water in from the street and fills tanks on the roof automatically. That sound meant his pump had started pulling water. But from where? Maybe it was nothing. Pumps run all the time. Coincidences happen. But I kept the thought in the back of my mind. When the noise stopped, I did a little experiment. I walked around the house, one tap at a time, checking the pressure. And sure enough, everything was back to normal. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe the system just fluctuated sometimes. Maybe the city was doing something. Maybe. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not just with the plumbing, but with the entire arrangement next door. The man who never spoke, the glares, the sudden drops in pressure timed perfectly with that hum. And the more I thought about it, the less it felt like coincidence, and more like a pattern. By the second week, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The pattern was too clean to be random. Every time his pump kicked on, my water pressure dipped. It didn't matter what time of day, morning, late evening, even once at midnight when I was just rinsing out a dog bowl. The moment that mechanical hum started next door, my faucets turned sluggish. I wasn't imagining it. And it wasn't just pressure. The bills were starting to make sense now, too. Before I moved in, I had access to the property's water account. The previous owners mentioned how the bill had slowly climbed during the years the house sat empty. At the time, they blamed it on old leaks and humidity damage. And I believed them. After all, pipes don't age gracefully when left unused. A slow drip here, a cracked joint there, those numbers can add up. But the bills weren't reflecting minor leaks. They were consistent and higher than expected. You don't pay that much water tax on an empty house unless something's flowing, and flowing regularly. That's when it really clicked. At some point over the last few years, while the house sat unguarded behind a padlock and a broken front door, the neighbor must have made himself comfortable. He wasn't just annoyed about losing access to an empty property, he was mad because he'd been using it. Specifically, its water line. I couldn't prove it yet, but I felt it in my bones. It fit. He had the motive, the opportunity, and all the passive-aggressive energy of someone who thought he'd gotten away with it. What I couldn't figure out was how. I had no visible pipes leading from my property into his, nothing obvious. And I wasn't about to hop his fence and start playing detective. I didn't want to give him a single excuse to turn this into a neighborly feud. I just wanted to know the truth. So I waited. Every time I heard his pump start up, I checked mine. The pressure dropped. Every time it stopped, it returned. I repeated it over and over, quietly confirming what I already suspected. And the more certain I became, the more that initial feeling of unease began to morph into something heavier. Not just irritation, violation. Because this wasn't just about water. This was about someone helping himself to something that wasn't his, assuming I'd either never find out or never do anything about it. It was about entitlement. This quiet, slimy kind of arrogance that seeps into the walls of a place when nobody's watching. I hadn't said a word to him yet. I hadn't even hinted that I knew. But every time I turned on the tap, every time I heard that pump next door kick into gear, it chipped away at my patience. At first, I didn't even want revenge. I just wanted him to stop, to act like an adult, pay for his own utilities, and respect the fact that the house next door wasn't his playground anymore. But it became clear, pretty quickly, that wasn't going to happen. So I stopped thinking like a neighbor and started thinking like someone with leverage. Once I accepted what was happening, my focus shifted from suspicion to certainty. I needed confirmation. Not for anyone else's sake, just mine. I didn't want to act on a hunch. I wanted to know exactly what he was doing, how long it had been going on, and how deep the problem ran. So I started checking everything. Every pipe, every valve, every exposed section of plumbing on my side of the property. Most of it was buried or tucked behind sealed walls, but a few lines ran along the side yard, old, sun-bleached PVC snaking out from where the utility line connected to the house. One of them had a sealed-off cap. It looked like it had once led somewhere, but it had been cut and plugged, professionally, but not recently. I took a picture, noted the position, and left it alone. If it was once active, maybe that's how he'd tapped in. But without ripping up my wall or his fence, I couldn't know for sure. Still, the signs were all there. It didn't matter if I found the literal connection point. I already understood the pattern. The timing was precise. I tested it obsessively, waiting for his pump to come on, then immediately testing my own taps. Weak. Always weak. Then as soon as the pump cut out, full pressure, like nothing had happened. And even more damning, I started keeping track of how much water I was using. I counted every load of laundry, every shower, every car wash, every time I refilled the dog's bowls or watered the garden. I even logged how long each tap ran and made conservative estimates based on flow rate. I was meticulous. The next bill came in, higher than it should have been, not by a lot, but enough to prove that someone else was using the supply. That's when the irritation boiled over into something sharper, because it wasn't about money. Water is cheap here. Even with 3 dogs, regular garden maintenance, and weekend car washes, my bill barely cracked $5. What he was taking from me wasn't breaking the bank. But it wasn't about the $5. It was about the principle, the boldness, the absolute nerve of someone to slip into an abandoned house, run a line, maybe even dig one, and just start pulling resources like they were entitled to them. And now, here I was, living in that house, paying for that supply, and he hadn't stopped. He just assumed I wouldn't notice. Or worse, that I wouldn't care. It sat wrong with me, deeply wrong. I didn't go next door. I didn't ring his doorbell or leave a passive-aggressive note. That would have felt like giving him control, like this was some neighborly misunderstanding we needed to work out over tea. No, this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft. But I wasn't going to react emotionally. I wasn't going to play into his silence with my own outburst. I was going to take my time. I was going to be smart. I was going to fix the problem. Not by confronting it, but by making it impossible for him to keep going. He wanted to stay in the shadows? Fine, let him. But shadows don't protect you from consequences. I thought about confronting him more times than I'd like to admit. There were evenings I paced my own hallway, rehearsing sentences in my head, imagining what I'd say if I just walked over and knocked on his door. But every version ended the same way, with him denying it, feigning ignorance, or worse, twisting it back on me like I was the problem. And that's the thing about people like him. They've made an art of skating just beneath the surface of wrongdoing. No proof, no confession, just enough plausible deniability to make you second-guess yourself. I wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of that game, so I stopped thinking in terms of conversation. I didn't need to prove anything to him. I didn't need him to admit what he'd done. I just needed him to feel it, in a way he couldn't ignore or deflect. And that's when the idea came to me. It was so obvious I almost laughed out loud. If the man had connected his water pump to my supply line, then the solution was simple. Remove the supply. Not permanently, not illegally, just long enough for consequences to set in. The genius of it was in its simplicity. I wouldn't have to step foot on his property. I wouldn't have to damage a single pipe or touch anything that didn't belong to me. All I had to do was turn off my water from the main valve, the one tucked behind a hatch on the side of the house, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. And I would wait, just like I had before. I started watching more carefully, noting exactly when his pump kicked on and how long it usually ran. He wasn't discreet about it. The vibration echoed faintly through the walls if I stayed quiet enough. The noise had gone from subtle background to something I could identify with surgical precision. On Monday, I heard it hum to life mid-afternoon, loud, rhythmic, impatient. He must have had one of his tanks running low. That was my cue. I slipped outside and shut the valve. Not fully, just enough to halt the pressure entirely. No water in, no water out. I went back inside, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and waited. Now here's what makes this so satisfying. In houses like ours, water tanks are controlled by a ball valve system. When the water level drops below a certain point, the valve opens, sending a signal to the pump to activate. The pump then pushes water into the tank until it fills back up and the valve closes. But if no water enters, the valve stays open. The pump keeps trying. And without water flowing through the line, that pump just runs and runs, dry, hot, straining against resistance it can't overcome. It's not just inefficient, it's dangerous. Any plumber will tell you, starving a pump of water is a fast track to burnout. Literally. I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I just wanted to cause enough of a hiccup that he'd finally understand what he was doing, and that it was over. If the pump overheated, that was on him. If it damaged something, again, not my fault. But what I didn't anticipate, not fully, was how old his infrastructure really was. I knew his house was dated. The concrete told its own story. But I didn't realize just how fragile his wiring still was. From the looks of it, everything inside that house was stuck in the 90s, patched over, never properly upgraded. And that dry-running pump? It didn't just overheat. It pushed the whole system over the edge. By the time evening rolled around, I had already forgotten the valve was off. The pump had gone silent again after its initial struggle, and everything on my end was peaceful. I was curled up on the couch, one dog at my feet, the other two already asleep on the rug. It felt like a small victory. Quiet, calm, the satisfying kind of stillness that comes after setting something right without saying a single word. But around 3 a.m., I woke up to voices. Not shouting, not yet, but hurried whispers, tense and confused, coming from next door. The walls were thick, but the night was still. I didn't need to press my ear to the window to know something had gone wrong. Lights flicked on in both upper floors of his house. I saw shadows pacing. A woman appeared at the balcony, clearly irritated, phone in hand. More voices followed, raised now, clipped and sharp. Then came the shouting. No power, no water, no explanations. The tenants had figured it out before the landlord did. In this country, electricity and water are considered essential services, especially in rental properties. You can't just lose both without triggering alarms. Legal ones. And landlords are responsible for making sure those services are available, maintained, and reliable. When they're not, the consequences aren't just financial. They're formal. The tenants weren't just angry. They were furious. One of them packed a suitcase before sunrise and walked out without looking back. I sat in my living room, lights off, sipping lukewarm tea and listening to the fallout unfold. I hadn't expected it to go that far. I thought maybe the pump would shut off, maybe burn out and force him to deal with the repair. But the wiring must have been older than I thought. Brittle, overloaded, never built to handle a motor running dry for hours on end. Without water to flow through, the pump kept drawing power non-stop, pushing heat and current through fragile lines until something finally gave. A fuse, maybe. A short. Who knows? But whatever it was, it cascaded. No pump meant no tank refill. No water in the tank meant no flow to the tenants. No pressure meant angry calls, complaints, and, as I later found out, 2 official reports filed with the police by the end of that very day. And here's the thing. When it comes to utilities, our laws aren't vague. If a tenant files a complaint about a lack of water or electricity and the investigation finds negligence, the landlord is liable, and they don't need a court order to issue a fine. The penalty gets assigned first. The burden to challenge it comes after, through court, if they dare. He didn't challenge anything, because he knew. He knew it was his fault. Not just because of the wiring, not just because of the burned-out pump, but because of everything he had done in the years before. He had treated someone else's property like an open tap, connected himself to a supply that wasn't his, and assumed no one would ever close the valve. But I had. Quietly. Legally. Without ever stepping foot on his side of the fence. And that tiny decision, that single flick of a valve, had set off a chain reaction that he couldn't control. The morning after was a slow unraveling. Not for me, but for them. I had turned my water supply back on around sunrise, casually, like nothing had happened. My taps worked fine. My dogs got their breakfast. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink and didn't even glance at the house next door. But I knew what I'd hear. By mid-morning, the real shouting had started. Not from the landlord. He was still quiet, still pretending the world would sort itself out if he just waited. But the tenants? They were done waiting. They wanted answers. And he had none. One of them, the younger guy who lived on the top floor, stood outside on the shared walkway, arms flailing, phone pressed to his ear as he yelled into the receiver. Something about basic living standards and reporting this today. The other tenant, an older woman from the second floor, looked more tired than angry, but I could see her packing through the open window. Slow, methodical, resigned. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just watched. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. This wasn't just a neighbor losing a few luxuries. This was a landlord who had failed to maintain the minimum requirements for his tenants. Power and water. Things we take for granted until they're gone. And in this country, failure to provide those things isn't just a private inconvenience. It's a legal violation. The tenants filed formal complaints that same day. I learned this through a friend who works at a local enforcement office. Small city, tight circles. Both reports cited long-term issues with the wiring and intermittent access to water. But now, with everything failing at once, it crossed the line from annoying to uninhabitable. And once that threshold is crossed, things move quickly. An inspector came by within 48 hours, didn't even knock on my door, just headed straight to the house next door, clipboard in hand, questions ready. I stood behind my curtain and watched it all unfold like the quiet climax of a slow-burning film. The landlord didn't argue. He didn't even look surprised. He knew what had happened. Maybe not every technical detail, but the result was loud and clear. The city fined him $500 on the spot. A hefty sum here, not life-ending, but damaging. Enough to make a dent, especially for someone already living off dwindling rent checks. And worse, he was ordered to return the full security deposits to both tenants and told the house couldn't be leased again until all systems, water and electrical, were properly overhauled and inspected. No water, no power, no income. The tenants were gone within days. The younger one didn't even wait for repairs. He loaded his things into a friend's truck and disappeared before the sun had set. The older woman followed the next afternoon, silent, suitcase in hand, no goodbye. I never exchanged a single word with either of them. I wasn't their enemy. I wasn't their savior. I was just the quiet neighbor who had turned off a tap at the right moment and watched the whole thing implode. And as for the landlord, he went very still after that. No more pacing, no more sitting outside with that sour look on his face. He stayed indoors, curtains drawn. I didn't see him again until Sunday morning, standing at the gate with a duffel bag in hand, waiting for a cab. Apparently, he was moving in with his daughter. Temporarily, he'd said, but it didn't look temporary. The house was dark, stripped bare of energy, like it had finally given up. All because of a water line he never should have touched. The cab pulled up just past 9 a.m. He stepped out of his gate slowly, one hand gripping the strap of his bag, the other resting against the frame like he wasn't sure he wanted to let go. For a second, I thought he might turn around, maybe out of pride or habit or just denial. But he didn't. He didn't even look back at the house. He just got in and shut the door. I watched from behind my window, same place I'd stood so many times before. And in that moment, he didn't look like the silent sentry anymore, the grumpy neighbor with the scowl and the cheap wiring. He just looked small, worn down, like someone who had finally run out of ways to pretend things were still under control. I later found out that his daughter lived in the suburbs, one of those satellite towns just far enough out that the buses only run twice a day. He didn't own a car anymore, probably sold it years ago. He hadn't worked in a decade. Retired mechanic, fixed small engines and scooters out of his shed until his hands gave up on him. His entire income had been coming from those 2 rental floors. That was his plan. Live on the ground floor, rent the top 2, coast through old age without bothering anyone. Except he had bothered someone, and he thought he could get away with it. He thought slipping a pipe into the empty house next door was harmless, like borrowing a cup of sugar, if sugar came pressurized and on someone else's bill. He never imagined someone would notice, and even if they did, he definitely didn't expect them to care. But I noticed, and I did care. The beauty of the whole thing, what still amazes me, is that I never once had to raise my voice. I didn't need threats. I didn't need lawyers or drama or confrontations in the street. I didn't even have to be present for the fallout. I just watched the cause roll gently into effect, like a domino I barely touched. And now, he's out. No tenants, no rent, no electricity in a house too old to live in without modern upgrades. No water unless he finds the money to overhaul the plumbing. No income. Just a faded memory of when he could sneak past the edges of responsibility, and no one would hold him accountable. The day after he moved out, he came by one last time. I was in the yard, trimming the hedges along the gate, when he walked up and stood on the other side of the bars. He didn't look angry, just tired. That kind of tired that doesn't come from lack of sleep, the kind that comes when your world quietly collapses and no one even notices. He asked me, politely even, if I had turned off the water that day. I smiled, casual, like it meant nothing. "Oh yeah," I said. "Had a leak in one of the old pipes. Shut off the mains while I waited for the plumber. Didn't want water spraying into the walls again." He nodded once, just once, like he understood every unspoken word between the lines. He didn't argue. He didn't accuse me. He just said, "Okay," turned around and walked back toward the curb. He never came back. "I've already scheduled a plumber to come by and redo the external lines, rip out anything that might even look like it connects to another property. I want it clean, sealed, secure. No more ambiguity, no more loopholes. It's quiet now. The house feels like mine in a way it hadn't before. No more staring from the side window. No more silent tension radiating from next door. No more dips in pressure or the hum of someone else's motor leeching off what I pay for." He thought he was being clever, taking a little, never enough to be noticed. But what he failed to consider was this: some of us notice everything, and we don't always fight with noise. Sometimes all it takes is silence and a shut-off valve.